Hello and welcome back to Experience Gain. Today I want to talk about understanding hit points and describing combat to make the whole gaming experience more narrative for your players. Dungeon Masters have a lot to keep track of in their games, and sometimes in the middle of a large combat it's difficult to remember to narratively describe your actions or the actions that the players and monsters are taking. And it's also tough to, on the fly, come up with descriptions that are engaging and cinematic and visual for the injuries that players suffer or monsters suffer while dealing damage and losing hit points. So I wanted to make a video on this subject because it's something that I struggle with and it's something I've been working on for my own games and something that I have some thoughts on that I think are a little different from how most players run their games. Now, in order to get anywhere with this, I think we have to start with understanding what hit points actually are. This might sound a little basic, but I promise that it's a little more complicated than it seems up front. If you ask any person what hit points are, they're likely to say something to the effect of hit points are the representation of how much damage you can take. When you have no more hit points, when you run out of health, you die. Right? It started really in D&D and these kinds of games, but since then, it's become a staple of just about every game, whether it's tabletop or video game. But in Dungeons & Dragons, hit points aren't just a measure of how much damage you can take. They're actually more than that. They're a measure of your character's ability to avoid a killing blow. Now, those two things might seem like the same thing, but they're not. One is talking about your character being able to take X number of hits, X number of damage, right? I can be cut this many times, blasted by a fireball this many times, but that's really not what I think hit points are supposed to be about, and I think taking that definition causes some problems later on, which I'll get to. If you instead think about hit points as a means to avoid a lethal blow, right, a resource that you have that diminishes over time until in the end, when you have no hit points left, you run out of hit points, you're going to be knocked unconscious or potentially killed. That's going to lead to a much more narrative experience with both hit points and combat. And honestly, I think the Player's Handbook supports this description. Let's look at the PHB description on page 180. It says, hit points represent a combination of physical and mental durability, the will to live, and luck. Creatures with more hit points are more difficult to kill. Those with fewer hit points are more fragile. A creature's current hit points, usually just called hit points, can be any number from the creature's hit point maximum down to 0. This number changes frequently as a creature takes damage or receives healing. Whenever a creature takes damage, that damage is subtracted from its hit points. The loss of hit points has no effect on a creature's capabilities until the creature drops to 0 hit points. So there's a couple really important things in there, including the idea that hit points are not just physical durability. They also combine mental durability, the will to live, and luck. They're more than just a physical attribute, and especially they're not just physical, because if it was, right, if it represented your limbs getting cut off, then your capacity to fight would be reduced. But it says specifically that losing hit points doesn't affect your capabilities. So I think the implication is that no injury sustained is actually meant by the book to be substantially serious until the last one that brings you down to or below 0 hit points. I know this is kind of a far out idea for how D&D is typically played, but hear me out. If we take hit points to be more than just physical, it gives you as a dungeon master a ton more opportunities to be descriptive in your combat. Because now when someone gets hit, it's not necessarily just about, oh, their arm got nicked or their leg got cut. It can be much more involved than that. It can involve the luck components, the will to live, the mental durability components of hit points. I don't know if you've had this problem, but I've had a problem before where a lot of damage is rolled and I want to create and make it an immersive, narrative, interesting moment, but I can't cut off someone's arm. I can't leave a substantial gash that's actually going to hurt or impact how they play by the rules. And so I struggle to find unique descriptions, and I'll end up saying the same thing over and over again, or during the course of a longer combat, I can abandon actually trying to describe combat at all because it's hard not to be repetitive and not to say the same things if you know that none of the damage you're dealing can actually leave a substantial physical mark, unless you're deciding to play with an expanded rule set where that is part of the rules, which we can talk about another time. you can't hurt your players in substantial ways or else they'll feel it's unfair. So moving into the mental durability and the other components of hit points and looking at those as places to provide narrative flavor and description between blows is a great opportunity to give you more than just a couple lines to choose from or potential ways to describe action when you're describing combat. I'll talk about this more in the combat section, but I think this kind of approach can not only improve your experience in combat, but also your experience around character progression and even healing. So I want to start by talking about those two sections first, before diving into the meatier subject that is combat. Let's start with character progression. As your character gains experience and you take new levels in a class you already have or in new classes, you also gain hit points. Every class has a different hit point rating based off the hit dice of the class. That ranges from D6, which can represent a range from 1 to 6 hit points gained every class level for something like a wizard, which is squishier, to a barbarian that has a D12, since they're much more physically tougher and durable. But the increase of your hit points doesn't just mean that you're getting physically tougher. A wizard or a rogue that levels up isn't just getting bulkier. The increase of your hit points over these levels also represents the development of your luck, or perhaps your divine favor, or your martial skill and general awareness of your surroundings and ability to avoid getting hurt. By knowing that hit points reflect that and considering that, it encourages your players in your group to think about how they respond to danger and the fact that when they're losing hit points, they're not necessarily just taking physical blows, but it might be mental blows too. And so I think it can also encourage them to build out the emotional side of their characters and understand how do they act under pressure. What are the weaknesses that they prey to? Is your character fearful? And so as they lose hit points, are they becoming more and more afraid of the combat? Are they headstrong and maybe reckless? And so as they lose hit points, becoming more and more reckless, are they lacking confidence? And so their blows are getting weaker, or they're more likely to give in and surrender the lower on hit points there are. This dimension of characterization, I think, is typically not considered too much in D&D and is at least not reflected in the mechanics. But by opening up the emotional dimension of hit points, you encourage players to think about this side of the characters that they play and make it a central part of your gaming experience. This also leads us to healing. Now, in the case of the suggestion that I'm making, healing becomes about more than just your wounds closing up or scars forming. It also becomes about your mental and emotional state, and those two returning to normal after the adrenaline rush or the intensity of a fight. Let's say you were brought to 0 hit points over the course of a fight, and you were playing a fearful character. Dropping to 0 hit points and almost dying as you're growing more fearful might be a pretty traumatizing experience for your character, especially depending on the kind of monster you were up against. So it makes sense that after that fight, not only do you have a little bit of physical healing to do, but some emotional healing to do, as your will to fight takes time to return, and you need to steel yourself for future conflicts. In fact, your hit points still being low in the next fight also makes sense, because you're not being followed by necessarily lingering physical injuries, but by the lingering fear of your last combat, or the lack of confidence that you now feel from that last combat that was tougher on you is now following you to this next fight and making it harder for you to defeat incoming prey until you take the time to rest and take some distance from how difficult and how dangerous fighting in the world of Dungeons & Dragons can be. I want to take a second here and talk about resting as well, because outside of magical spells and healing potions, resting is the main way that your characters recover. And the way that you deal with resting, I think, has very important implications on how the hit points and the health of your characters actually feels over the course of your games. So there's two kinds of rests that are available to your players. There are short rests, which last typically at least an hour, and there are long rests, which last around 8 hours, are meant to be not strenuous, and can only be taken once per day. At the end of a short rest, characters can spend the hit dice they've earned by gaining new levels in order to recover hit points. If you're a wizard, like the example that I've been using, you would, at the end of your short rest, roll 1d6, because your hit dice is a d6, and whatever number came up, you would then add your constitution modifier to, and the total resulting number would be the amount of hit points you gained back. You can then choose to continue rolling additional hit dice from the total number you have until you're either fully back up to health, you have no more hit dice, or you decided this is enough healing for now. You have a number of hit dice equal to the number of levels you have in that class. A 6th level wizard would have 6d6 hit dice. If you multi-class, you would potentially, let's say you were a barbarian wizard multi-class that had 4 levels in wizard and 2 levels in barbarian, you would have 4d6 wizard hit dice and 2d12 barbarian hit dice. Now, at the end of the long rest, you don't need to roll your hit dice because you, by the book, recover all the hit points that you've lost. You also regain half of the total hit dice that you can have. So if you have 6 hit dice, at the end of a long rest, you would regain up to 3 of those until you reach the maximum amount you can have. You can never have more hit dice than your level. But there are some cool alternative rules on how to handle healing and hit dice in resting that I think are worth considering if you like the idea of making hit points and health and combat damage a more narrative part of your games. This rule is pretty intense. Simply put, it states no natural healing. At the end of a long rest, you don't recover all your hit points. You just have another opportunity to spend hit dice, same as a short rest. In addition, you still recover the half of your hit dice like you do on a regular long rest, but it makes that resource a lot more valuable and it makes combat a lot more dangerous because you can't just sleep for a night and then be fine. Combat becomes more traumatic and, like I said, lingers. The injuries that your players suffer emotionally, physically, or spiritually can last far longer than just one night in this case. And I think that's a great thing if it fits the kind of campaign or adventure that you're running. One alternative modification that you can make to this rule, if you decide to go with it, is that at the end of a long rest, instead of only recovering half of your hit dice, you recover all of your hit dice. And this kind of balances out and finds a happier middle ground between the more intense, gruesome, kind of lingering, traumatic combat and the easier one day heals everything standard style of play. These rules and alternatives can be found in page 267 of the Dungeon Master's Guides. They're suggested by wizards, and there's also some really great suggestions in there on how to alter the actual length of time of rests in order to get something closer to the kind of narrative experience you want for your games that I highly recommend you check out. Alright, so we've covered character progression and we've covered healing. Now we can talk about the big one. We can talk about combat and how to describe it effectively using this new approach. First, let's explore how combat typically goes. The way combat works is a player decides what they want to do. They say that they're going to attempt it. They roll to actually try to do the thing that they accomplish. The results of the roll are evaluated by the Dungeon Master, and if the roll is successful, the Dungeon Master then resolves the roll and says what the result of the player's action is, not only mechanically by tracking the hit points lost based off the damage dealt, but also narratively by describing how the blow looks. That's not the way that you have to do it, but that's the way it's typically done. If it happens to be a monster going or a enemy controlled by the Dungeon Master, then it's the Dungeon Master that also controls what the monster is going to do. In order to describe combat effectively as a Dungeon Master, you need to keep track of not only how the player is attacking, but the capacities of the monster and what it can defend like, and whatever situational or environmental details are going on, including the actual setting that you're fighting in, but other effects that have been put into effect previously, like an area of effect spell or a ready action that another player has. It's a lot for a DM to manage, and so I think in order to describe combat effectively, the Dungeon Master has to work with the players. There's a few different ways that you can do this. One, you can have the players track the hit points of the monsters. Have them track the damage they're dealing, have them add it up, and they'll tell you how much damage they've done total overall, and you can just track the total number of hit points the monster has. That way, instead of going back and writing in your notes the diminishing hit points of the monster, you can be focused on keeping the narrative moving, alive, and keeping the battle engaging. Another thing that you can do is always ask what your players are trying to accomplish when they attack. This is a hard one because sometimes, especially in larger groups, combat can be a pretty slow part of the game, and it's in our, or at least in my natural instinct, to want to keep the game moving. But by taking a second and asking what your players are trying to do, you'll get a better answer from them than just, I swing at the monster, or I shoot a firebolt at it. Ask them, put the burden on them to make a narrative proclamation of what they're attempting to do. For example, if I was a player and my dungeon master asked me to describe my action, I could say something more than just I attack the owlbear with my mace. I could say, I take my mace and I try to swing the bandit in the chin to knock him out. I know as a player that I won't knock him out just with one blow, especially if combat's just started. But as a character, that is an understandable motive to try to end the combat, and it's a narrative action. And all of a sudden, we've got a scene in our heads, more than if I was just like, yeah, I'm gonna swing at the bandit, right? It's a little bit of difference, and as you start to do this, your players will get more comfortable and more used to this, and combat will get back to the speeds that you had before, or potentially even faster if you're offloading some of the burden of managing combat and keeping track of everything to the players at your table. If you have this description from your players of what they attempt to do, and the attack hits and then deals damage, and you want to describe it without having it be a physical injury, you could say something like, the bandit dodges back wildly, trying to avoid your unexpected blow, and stumbles back off balance. I know, it's not as satisfying as landing a meaty hit, but if you do this, you don't get that scenario that happens sometimes of your players pounding and pounding and pounding on an opponent, landing hit after hit after hit, and not understanding why this enemy isn't going down. In this style of describing, a few good, clean hits on an enemy are all they need to kill it, because that's all you're going to describe before the enemy falls. On a miss, the difference would be the bandit, cockily dodges your blow, and that's it. Like, he's still just standing there, still right up in your face. It's a small difference, but you'll get used to it over time, because now all of a sudden you're getting into other ways that damage can be dealt to your opponents rather than just physical. Another example is if your wizard shoots a firebolt at a goblin. You could describe it as something like this. The firebolt ignites the goblin's arrow, and he quickly tosses it to the ground and puts it out. He looks back up at you, now fear visible in his eyes. Again, you haven't left a lingering mark on the goblin, which they're low hit points, so only 1 or 2 hits probably would kill them automatically, but now there's a more narrative dimension to the combat. On the other end, when you're dealing damage to your players, you can also ask them how they're defending. For example, the giant gets ready to stomp his foot down on you. What do? The player says, well, I roll out of the way. You know that really what they mean is I try to roll out of the way. And if your attack misses, cool, they've successfully rolled out of the way. You've already established what they're trying to do in reaction. If they fail, well, then you can just describe it something like this. The giant anticipates your roll and move his large foot, the shadow falling even at the end of your roll, and stomps you on the ground. That's a physical blow, but at least it's a little bit more narratively encouraging. It sounds complicated, but I promise it's just improv and it'll get easier as you do it. Like I said, I'm no master at it. It's a lot easier to do it here in the setting of a video than in the middle of the game when you're 2 hours in, running for 6 or 7 players, and trying to juggle everything else going on in my head too. If you're thinking that this seems weird, it probably only seems weird because we're so fixed in describing combat and damage dealt and loss of hit points as being physical. Changing here is the hard part. Even blows that hit don't need to leave a physical mark in order to deal damage to an enemy's willpower or to a player's stamina. You might be thinking, well, that doesn't make sense. How is a hit that deals damage actually hurting an enemy if there's no physical injury? Well, like I mentioned, it can hurt them through impairing their will to live, right? A strong hit might just be a representation of an enemy or a monster putting one of your players or the group on their back foot and making them less likely to want to continue the fight. And personally, I think this idea fits well with certain kinds of gameplay where combat is a little more punishing, right? Getting injured has substantial repercussions. The only hit that actually needs to land directly, that needs to leave a lasting physical mark, is the last one, the one that actually knocks a creature unconscious or kills them. Everything else until then is a step towards that. In time, if the combat is extended and things keep going the player's way, the creature will fall one way or the other, and it's that last blow that will sink in straight through and actually kill the monster. I know I've been harping on the emotional and kind of spiritual sides of the damage that can be dealt, but you can obviously have physical damage dealt too. In fact, physical damage can be really compelling if you take extra care to make it slightly more narrative than just thinking about it as a permanent, lasting, lingering injury. And the key with describing actions well is to, one, make sure to communicate clearly and consider how this specific attack is different or unique from others that have already happened. I think the worst cases of descriptive combat are when you say, yeah, you hit him just like last time, or, oh, you know, first player goes and yeah, you leave a nasty cut in his right arm, and then the second player goes and you also leave a nasty cut, but this time along his left arm. I realize I inversed those, but I just don't find those very satisfying narratively, and I imagine that you don't either. Take your time if you have to. Ask your players what they're trying to do. Ask your players how they defend. And then in your end, consider the monsters. Consider their capabilities and skill, and consider their physical makeup. An armored knight might see their armor getting bludgeoned in with dents or scratches alongside it. A wolf might see cuts within the fur or patches of fur burnt or ripped off. An elemental could just see their integrity failing and the entire thing losing form or struggling to hold together as it suffers more damage. Or, in the same way we talked about personalities for your players, they might fall prey to their own personality flaws. They might grow more angry, or more arrogant, or more fearful, or more reckless along the way. And all of a sudden, you've got a really dynamic world where when people get hurt, they act differently. And having your enemies feel distinct from each other is key to keeping your campaign and adventures interesting and keeping your players on their toes and engaged in your world and your adventures from session to session. And this is where I get to a suggestion that I've kind of hinted at, which is, if you want to make the narrative aspect of your combat more engaging, more interesting, and more integral to your style of play, let the narrative actually influence the mechanics. If your players are fighting a shielded enemy, and you've been saying things like that enemy is using its shield to block the blows, perhaps eventually the shield just gets too beat up and it's useless now, and the enemy has to kind of tosses it away and goes two-handed with the weapon that they're wielding. If you do that, now you've got a scene, now you've got a world where people are actually reacting, the monsters are reacting to what your players are doing, you're keeping your players engaged, and it might feel like you're shooting yourself in the foot a little bit, but as a DM, I think the job isn't to always give the toughest challenges, but more to make a compelling story world for your players to play in and adventure in. If you want to get into describing specific types of damage in interesting ways, you can look in the player handbook. I think it's page 196. 196 of the player handbook has a description of all the different damage types that can be done in D&D that can maybe spark some ideas of how you might describe them in not only physical ways, but also emotional or spiritual ways. For example, the crack of lightning and thunder coming from a wizard's palm might scare someone, or acid corroding the armor of an enemy might make them more reckless and want to finish this fight faster than they thought to before. Allow the descriptions to inform what happens and what the players can do. It's a pretty big homebrew departure. You can start with some of the easier steps up front, but if you do this, I don't think that you'll be disappointed. Just try to stay consistent in your rulings and make sure that you're having fun and the players are having fun. It's not about you beating the players as much as it is about creating something cool and memorable that your players are going to be really excited about, and everyone at the table will have had a good time enjoying that night or that day. And if every once in a while you want there to be a major physical blow that goes against kind of what we've talked about and is more standard of someone's arm getting crashed in, go for it. You can keep the narrative impact if you want to, saying that arm is no longer usable, but you don't have to. There's plenty of good occasions where it just makes sense to give the players or even the monsters a bone and saying, yeah, that one lands. For example, if they roll max damage or really high damage on a hit, or if they roll a critical, that's a great opportunity to say, this isn't emotional, this isn't spiritual, or if it is, it's a pretty major blow to those. Or alternatively, yeah, you crush that person's leg, or you leave a nasty gash down the body, or something lingering where it's a cut down an enemy's face, and if that enemy gets away, now they've got a new scar that will make them more distinct and will be evidence of their past encounters with the party. So, I mean, why bother doing all this? It's work, right? It's not easy to do, and it's something that is hard to do, especially at first, but gets easier over time if you decide to switch over to the system or try it for a one-shot, or just talk to your players and say, hey, for this session, for this combat, I'm going to try to run things this way. But there's a ton of benefits, not limited to just combat becoming more visual and combat becoming more narrative and dynamic. There is also the great benefit of, if you do this, your players are not going to ask you how monsters are looking, right? I don't know if your players at your table are like mine, but sometimes my players will ask, or I will ask if I'm at the table, how's that monster looking, right? I'm asking, is it bloodied? Is it looking rough? How much more do we have to take before that jerk is dead? Well, if you're describing the combat along the way and how the monster is changing and reacting to the narrative, they should be able to tell how well the monster is faring and how quickly it's progressing towards death. And you can have a few kind of trigger words that they know after it gets bloodied, like, for example, Matt Mercer's "it's looking rough," that lets them know, hey, you're on the right track, this is about where you are in the combat. Other ideas that I like are saying the monster is breathing heavily or moving slowly, or that, Bandit's eyes are darting to the corners trying to look for avenues to escape. Giving your players an inclination into the mental state of the enemies that they're facing will keep them informed and make them feel like they're in the fight and give them more to go off of than needing to rely on you as the DM. Instead, they'll be getting their information from the world itself, through you still, but in a more narrative, in-character, in-game kind of way. And there's another benefit, which is, let's say that you're in a major boss fight. Your party is going up against one of the major villains that you've managed to establish. When that enemy gets to 0 hit points, if you've been describing combat in this more narrative way that also uses the emotional and spiritual descriptions, well, instead of just having the enemy die or fall unconscious when they reach 0 hit points, you can instead have the enemy be broken. This isn't solely limited to boss fights, but it's great because so much of the time bosses just die suddenly, and that can be super rewarding for players, and I'm not against doing that, but sometimes it's useful to know that you can fall back on instead having an enemy be broken, and when they fall to 0 hit points, they instead are totally cowed, right? They're so afraid that they're just gonna give up, right? They surrender. If it's an enemy that kind of move is right for, it's a cool thing that players don't see too often because we're so used to 0 HP, meaning, okay, they're dead. Like, that's it. No other kind of solution, right? At 0 HP, let's say they're fighting a swordsmaster. 0 HP might mean the swords are broken, and the swordsmaster is now also kind of done with the fight, right? No more swords, no more swordmaster. And so rather than just being struck down and killed, the swordmaster can actually talk to the party and potentially get them the information that they want. There's one really important thing if you do this, which is if you keep the enemy alive when they reach 0 hit points and consider them broken, they can't have anything else to pull one over on the party. They can do that up to 0 hit points, but past 0 hit points, they should be spent. They don't have a teleportation spell ready or a scroll of invisibility. They're done. They're just like as if they're dead. They're at the mercy of the party. If you cheat them out of their kills in this way, that just sucks. That's poor sportsmanship. Anything that they wanted to try to do that they reasonably had access to should be done before they hit this point. Alright, so I mean, that's the video. We've talked about hit points, we've talked about how they can be more narratively treated in your games and impact everything from character progression to healing to combat, right? And helping you as a dungeon master run a more descriptive combat. And hopefully this helps you. You definitely don't have to do this. I don't think this is going to be for everyone, but I do encourage you watching to try it if you're interested. And if you do want to give it a shot, make it the one thing you're focusing on that session. Take a note card and add a few notes, write a few notes from this video or different things that'll help you remember to describe combat in the ways that we've been talking about. And just have it behind your DM screen to look back down upon. And if you do it, 2-3 times a session within a combat, that's a great start, and over time you'll just do it more and more. If you don't know what you've been watching, I'm Jeremy Malul, this is Experience Gain. This is a series that I recently started making all about how you can get the most out of your Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing games. If you liked this video, make sure you subscribe so you see new videos I make when I upload them every Friday. And leave a comment below if there's any topics in D&D or other role-playing games that you want me to cover. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.